Banks have long been targets for criminals because successfully breaking into one means a big payday. Many banks and their customers have now shifted their activity online, but while useful, it also provides cybercriminals with potentially even bigger paydays if they can hack into banks. I'm Danny Palmer. This is ZDNet Security Update, and with me to discuss how hackers are going after banks and evolving how they perform their attacks is James Muir, Threat Intelligence Research Lead at BAE Systems. Thanks for joining me, James. So what sort of cyber threats are financial services and banks looking at as we move into 2021?
Hi Danny, and thanks for having me on. First and foremost is really the major trend of 2020, which has been ransomware. So lots of FS organizations have been impacted either directly or indirectly by ransomware, and the threat as a whole is showing no signs of stopping as we go to the year end. I think we've seen over 1,000 double extortion victims now of ransomware, where data theft has been coupled into the attack, so raising the stakes for a ransom to be paid. So that'd be at the top of my list. Secondly, this year has been obviously very interesting with the COVID pandemic, and potentially one of the impacts that's had is it's been harder for criminals to do those big cyber heists that have ended up in physically money muling money out of the financial system. So the likes of the Lazarus Group have been quieter in that respect this year. So that's something that we might see change in years to come as COVID restrictions are lifted and it becomes easier for that type of activity. So that's something that I'd definitely be on the lookout for as a bank. Thirdly, I guess thematically in terms of technologies, so supply chain security is a massively hot topic and will continue to be so, and the emerging threat to cloud services as well. So both of those issues entangled quite succinctly in the recent activity that's been making the news in the last couple of weeks.
I guess a good place to start from those would be ransomware. We've seen the damage it can do to organizations, and for banks, if their systems are crippled, it's caused a lot of problems. And we've seen incidences here in the UK where various UK banks have had system crashes which have locked people out their accounts, and that's fortunately been in most cases resolved within a day. But I suppose if a bank falls victim to a ransomware attack and they're not willing to pay the ransom, that means people might not have access to their money for a long time.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, sort of top tier banks have not yet, at least in the West, become victim of ransomware attack, and that is a kind of unknown as to whether we will see that in future. There are far easier targets for ransomware operators than big banks, which is good, and they take their security very seriously and do the basics very well. But yeah, I mean, organizations such as Travelex, Finastra, there have been big casualties this year, and in Travelex's case as well, the attack on them at the turn of last year has gone some way to contributing to their going into administration. So there can be big impacts on organizations, and the whole FS ecosystem is something of a meshwork of interdependencies and relationships between different service providers. So yeah, the whole kind of concept of shared resilience and relying on each other to defend themselves and defend each other is a big topic.
Obviously, banks are working together to try and stop these sorts of things, but are cyber criminals now working together and collaborating in order to try and target banks? Because if you use this sort of movie comparison, when you watch a bank heist movie of your traditional bank, there's always a bunch of different people with different skills who have to do different things in order to get into the vault. Is that the same when it comes to cyber attacks against banks?
It certainly can be. So we've, in a number of incident response cases that our team have dealt with in FS organizations in recent years, we've seen quite good evidence of collaboration between distinct criminal groups. So they may know each other by some means, but they're referred to as distinct entities within this kind of cyber threat landscape. So examples such as TA505 appearing to be an initial access broker of sorts. So they do the getting in to victim organizations, then almost handing off that access to other criminal groups to then proceed with the attack from there. So TA505 have handed off access to the Silence Gang, for example. So yeah, there is a large degree of cooperation between some kind of ecosystems of criminality. That's something that we see play out in the ransomware space as well, quite frequently.
And this might seem like an obvious question, but if a hacking group gets into the network of a bank, what do they do? What are they stealing, and what are they after?
I mean, that can vary on a case-by-case basis. If the group is set out to try and make off with large sums of money, then they'll typically try and proceed from a kind of initial access point on, let's say, on the corporate network, through to some sort of payment system, some kind of interface that will allow them to either create fraudulent transactions or to perform some sort of manipulation that will be to their benefit. So that could be setting up fake credit cards, manipulating ATM transactions, or large inter-sum bank transfers over the SWIFT network, for example. So yeah, it's a question of motivation. It comes back to essentially, like I say, if the group is after big sums of money, they will know what they're after, and it'll be access to those specific systems.
And as we've seen in the past, the SWIFT network has been a target for this sort of thing before, with cyber criminals being able to make off with some quite large sums of money.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, just to reiterate, the SWIFT network itself is secure and is a primary example of international infrastructure that we all rely upon. It's really the interface between the bank and the SWIFT network, which is where attackers have managed to exploit weaknesses.
But would that be some sort of social engineering? So imagine in a lot of these cases, if you're dealing with millions of dollars, pounds, whatever currency it is, some sort of human has to be involved in the process of making that transfer. And social engineering, phishing is a massive problem for all organizations, but it's something that's a part and parcel of needing to steal money from banks if attackers are going that way.
Yeah, I think in a lot of these cases, it can be quite difficult to work out the initial access vector. Some of these groups are very good at covering their tracks. But yeah, as you say, social engineering via spear phishing is a very common tactic with a lot of groups. Certainly the Lazarus group use that very well. But they will explore other areas as well, other ways in. But yeah, there's always a human in the loop, as they say, and often it can be a social engineering attack, which is the way in.
On similar grounds, I suppose, is something that's covered in your recent report, of disinformation and fake news and how that can impact the banking system. Is this a fairly new thing? And if so, how does it work, and how are criminals exploiting this sort of activity?
Yeah, I mean, so disinformation is as old as time, I guess, and is most commonly related to election topics and other angles like that. But yeah, in terms of the FS system being a target for it, it is a threat. It is a concern. It's quite maybe a low concern at the moment. There's been a few examples of fake news campaigns against specific banks, and it seems to be for kind of grievance rather than market manipulation. But that's certainly plausible. The way that the FS markets react to bad news and fear can potentially be exploited in such a campaign. I think looking forwards, and the Carnegie Institute have done another nice paper on this actually, is the availability of kind of deep fake synthetic media technology to motivated criminals. So we might see more kind of unique uses of that. So in different takes on the business email compromise type attack, new spins on fraud that use kind of synthetic media, and that might be, in a related way, something to watch in years to come.
We've touched upon it there with the sort of manipulation and using technology to help these things along, but it's already happened, I suppose. There have been instances where voice manipulation has been used to say, I am your boss, please send this $300,000 as in business email fraud schemes, and that's something banks are going to have to be looking out for, I suppose.
Yeah, as you say, there are known examples. I guess we'll just see it trend to being more within the standard toolkit that these types of criminals use on a business as usual basis, I suppose.
So what can banks and other financial services companies do to try and stop themselves from falling victim to these kind of attacks, especially when the cyber criminals involved seem to be evolving and changing their tactics all the time.
Yeah, I mean that's the $64,000 question, or multi-million-dollar question in some cases. I think everything kind of has to be pinned on doing the basics right. I mean, it's a message that everyone's heard thousands of times, but it's worth repeating. And you can actually sort of view those basics quite nicely through a ransomware attack, if you like. I mean, there are ways along the entire kill chain of a ransomware attack that you can defend against, and defense in depth is a major topic. But I find it quite instructive to think about the start of the attack and the very end of the attack. So the start, blocking initial access or making initial access harder. So that comes down to effective patching policies, knowing what infrastructure you're exposing to the internet and making sure that's all as it should be. You're not exposing any RDP, you're managing authentication properly, etc. And yeah, as you say earlier, having good email security and awareness around phishing attacks and so on, all the way through to the very end of a ransomware attack. In the case where you are compromised and become a victim, really knowing that you can recover from such a situation is key. Having backups that are offline, testing those backups to make sure that you can respond and recover quickly is absolutely key, and is a major recommendation that we would issue in that regard. So moving away from the ransomware kind of situation, obviously there's a whole load of other things to consider. For banks, there's the CBEST scheme, for example, run by Bank of England, and similar schemes such as Tiber EU are great ways to test that banks are doing the basics right, and to pit their defences against red teams in kind of targeted attack scenarios. The Swift ecosystem we worked with Swift to produce the customer security program, which has been rolled out very effectively. And that's had a great effect on banks themselves. And yeah, coming back to my initial point around the kind of thematics, so next year, supply chain security, cloud security, these are areas which have received focus already, but continued focus on those areas is kind of key.
Some really good advice there, James. Thanks for joining me on ZDNet Security Update. And for more advice on how you can keep yourself secure online, keep watching ZDNet Security Update, subscribe to the ZDNet YouTube channel, and of course, keep reading ZDNet. Thanks for watching.